The moment did not look dramatic at first. There were no explosions, no alarms, no emergency announcements echoing through the hallways of international power. Just a quiet morning inside the United Nations Security Council chamber in New York, where diplomats from around the world had gathered as they always do, to listen, observe, and measure every word carefully, while the United States representative stood at the central podium, presenting Washington's latest position on the rapidly escalating crisis involving Iran, and everything seemed routine at the beginning as translators whispered through headsets, aides passed folders across polished desks, and cameras from global news networks recorded the meeting for audiences across continents. Yet beneath the calm surface, something was already shifting in the atmosphere, because the debate surrounding the Middle East had been intensifying for weeks. Oil prices had been fluctuating, shipping routes had grown uncertain, and governments from Europe to Asia had begun asking difficult questions about the long-term consequences of the strategy being pursued. But the exact moment when the tension became visible came unexpectedly, when one diplomat slowly pushed back his chair and stood up, gathering his papers as if leaving for a break. Except no break had been announced, and then another diplomat stood up as well, followed by several others until, within less than a minute, a small line of representatives was moving toward the exit doors while the American speech was still underway. The scraping sound of chairs across the marble floor, echoing through the chamber as cameras quietly turned to capture what was happening, creating a moment that would later circulate across television screens and social media feeds around the world, because diplomatic walkouts are rare events that send a powerful signal without requiring a single word. And for the officials watching from the back of the room, the meaning was immediately clear. Something had fractured within the fragile network of support that normally surrounds major international initiatives. Yet the scene inside the chamber was only part of the story unfolding that day, because outside the building, another group of reporters had gathered around a second podium, where Iran's foreign minister was scheduled to address the press. And when he finally stepped forward, he appeared calm, almost methodical, as he read from prepared notes before delivering a message that cut directly against the expectations Washington had been projecting for weeks, stating that Iran rejected the proposal presented by the United States, that negotiations could not happen under pressure, and that any future dialogue would require the removal of military and economic constraints first. And although the statement lasted only a few moments, its implications spread instantly across diplomatic circles and financial markets alike, because the White House had repeatedly suggested that talks were progressing quietly behind the scenes, hinting that a breakthrough might be near, and now the world was hearing a completely different narrative from the other side of the table, which forced analysts, investors, and political observers to reconsider whether the strategy that had been presented as decisive and effective was actually producing the intended results or pushing the situation toward a prolonged standoff instead. And the original plan had sounded straightforward when it was first described. Apply rapid and overwhelming pressure through sanctions, military deployments, and diplomatic isolation, so that the Iranian leadership would feel compelled to negotiate quickly, ideally within days rather than months. But international politics rarely follows such predictable timelines. Because every country involved has its own calculations, its own domestic pressures, and its own perception of risk and opportunity, and in this case Iran, appeared determined to demonstrate that it could endure the pressure longer than expected, reinforcing its internal messaging, coordinating with regional partners, and projecting the image of resilience rather than vulnerability. While at the same time many other governments around the world were quietly reevaluating their positions because the ripple effects of the confrontation were beginning to reach their own economies and political systems. European states worried about the stability of energy supplies that flowed through critical maritime routes. Asian manufacturing economies monitored shipping lanes that carried enormous volumes of global trade, and countries across the Middle East tried to balance their security relationships with the United States against the reality that escalating tensions in the region could threaten their own stability. And these considerations produced a subtle but noticeable shift in diplomatic behavior where public statements became more cautious calls for negotiation replaced language about pressure, and private conversations among leaders began focusing on how to prevent the crisis from expanding rather than how to intensify it. Yet none of these developments individually appeared dramatic enough to dominate headlines until the moment at the United Nations exposed the changing dynamics in a single visual scene that anyone could understand instantly. diplomats leaving their seats while a major power continued speaking, and once that image circulated, the broader narrative surrounding the crisis began to evolve, because it suggested that international unity, an essential ingredient in most successful diplomatic campaigns, might be weakening, and inside Washington policymakers now faced a complicated set of choices that offered no simple solutions. Military commanders warned that maintaining a large operational presence in the region over an extended period would strain logistics and personnel readiness. Economic advisors pointed to rising shipping costs and volatile commodity markets that could eventually affect consumers at home, while political strategists tracked polling data indicating that public support for prolonged international confrontations tends to decline when clear results fail to appear quickly, creating a situation where every possible move carried its own risks. Escalation might increase pressure but could also trigger wider conflict. Stepping back might reduce tension but could be interpreted as retreat, and remaining in a holding pattern would allow uncertainty to continue affecting global markets and alliances. Meanwhile, Iranian officials seem to believe that patience would ultimately strengthen their position because if they could demonstrate endurance long enough, the international coalition behind Washington might continue to fragment as different countries prioritize their own economic and strategic interests. And that belief itself contributed to the stalemate because both sides began acting under the assumption that time would eventually force the other to compromise first. Yet global systems, from energy supply chains to maritime insurance markets, rarely remain stable when major geopolitical questions linger unresolved, and the early signs of that instability were already appearing as oil traders responded to potential disruptions by driving price volatility. Shipping companies evaluated whether to reroute vessels away from areas considered risky, which added thousands of miles to certain trade routes. Insurers adjusted premiums to reflect higher geopolitical risk categories, and each of these decisions gradually translated into higher costs moving through the world economy, meaning that a diplomatic disagreement taking place in conference rooms and press briefings could slowly influence everyday realities for millions of people through more expensive fuel, increased transportation costs for goods, and delays within supply networks that modern industries depend upon, illustrating how interconnected the global system has become, where the movement of a few diplomats leaving a meeting or brief statement delivered at a podium can trigger reactions across financial markets, corporate planning departments, and government policy circles simultaneously. And this interconnectedness also means that moments which appear quiet in real time often gain significance later when historians and analysts look back and recognize them as turning points because they reveal when assumptions begin to shift and when participants start reconsidering strategies that previously seemed certain, and whether this particular episode ultimately becomes remembered as a temporary disagreement or the beginning of a deeper transformation in international relationships will depend on decisions that have yet to be made by leaders in multiple capitals around the world, since diplomacy is rarely defined by a single event, but rather by the accumulation of signals, responses, adjustments, and recalculations that unfold over weeks or months. Yet the image of that Security Council chamber, with delegates rising from their seats while the speech continued, captured in one frame the uncertainty now surrounding the situation. Uncertainty about whether pressure will produce compromise or resistance, uncertainty about how alliances will adapt to changing economic realities, and uncertainty about how the broader balance of influence will evolve in a world where multiple major powers are watching closely and interpreting every development through the lens of their own strategic ambitions. And for ordinary observers, the lesson may be that geopolitics does not always announce its turning points with dramatic spectacle, but sometimes reveals them through quieter signals that only gain meaning when connected to the larger story unfolding behind the scenes. A story about how nations pursue their interests, how alliances form and strain under pressure, and how the decisions made in the most formal diplomatic spaces can ripple outward across markets, industries, and societies in ways that are rarely visible at the moment. They begin but become unmistakable as time passes and the consequences accumulate.